In this video, it's going to be up to you to build a new version of our expense tracker. Previously in the course, we did build a little expense tracker app when we learned about objects and functions, but if you remember, we kept track of expenses via a single number. If we added a new expense, we just added it on to that single number. And this is okay, but it's not really great because we don't have a list of our expenses. So I can't figure out how much I'm spending on food, for example, and I can't see the individual cost of each expense. Now that we know about arrays of objects, we are going to model each expense using an object. That's going to allow us to have multiple pieces of data. We're going to have an expense description as well as the exact amount of the expense. That is going to allow us to search our expenses, delete expenses, and we'll still be able to analyze our data and get a total. Let's go ahead and kick things off by creating a brand new file in the arrays directory. I'm going to call this one expense-tracker.js, and in here we are going to break up this video into two separate challenges. So let's talk about what the first challenge is going to contain. Together, real quick, let's go ahead and create a const variable, and I'm going to call this account. This is going to be our starting place. It's going to be a simple object with two properties: name, the account holder's name, I'll just use my name, and expenses. Although expenses is actually going to be an array. So this is where we're going to store all of the various expenses. Down below, let's go ahead and document a few things related to what should be in expenses and what methods I'd like you to add to work with the account object. First up, the expense itself. So each expense is going to model a real world expense. And for now, we're going to model it using two properties. The first one is going to be the description, which is going to be a string. So if I am getting coffee, the description might be coffee at Capital One Cafe, for example. The other property is going to be the amount. The amount is just going to be a number of how much you spent. So if I spent $2 on coffee, I would pass in 2 as the amount property value. Now this just defines what should go in expenses. You're going to be creating methods to actually put things in expenses and analyze the data that's already in there. For this first challenge, there are going to be two methods, so functions as object properties on account, that I want you to create. The first one is going to be add expense, and the second one right here is going to be get account summary. So let's talk about add expense first. The add expense method is going to take two arguments. We are going to take in first the description for the expense, and the second one is going to be the amount. So we're taking in these two arguments, and what we need to do in add expense is add a new object onto the expenses array with the correct data. We have both of the pieces of data in as arguments. All we have to do is create that object and add it onto the list. Now that's going to allow us to populate the expenses array. The other method that you're going to be creating isn't going to take any arguments at all. Get account summary is going to total up all expenses, and you're going to print a little message like the following: Andrew Mead has, then right here the $sign, let's just say it's 1,250 in expenses, for example, where this is the account name, and this is a total that you're going to have to calculate. If you want to calculate the total, all you need to do is use for each to go through every single item in the expenses array. You can get the amount object and add it on to a variable. As you keep changing that variable, you'll come up with the total in expenses, and then you can add it into the template string. As always, feel free to use anything we've learned so far to get all of this done. Down below, let's go ahead and add a few calls just to make sure you're on the right track. Account dot add expense. I'm going to add it right here. Let's say it's rent. Let's say it's $950. I'll add one more. Account dot add expense. Let's say this one is coffee. I'll add this one at $2. Then the last thing I'm going to do is use our other method. So I'll use console.log to actually print something, and account.get account summary, and I am going to call it with no arguments, expecting my string to print, saying that Andrew Mead has $952 in expenses. All right, pause the video, knock this out, test your work, and when you're done, Click play. All right, how'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to get that done without too much trouble. First up, let's go ahead and create our add expense method. The method is going to live right on the account object alongside of our data. So right here, add expense. I'm going to set it up as a method by setting its value equal to a function. Now, does this function or method need to take any arguments? And the answer is yes. We set this up to take two different arguments, the description and the amount. We get both of these, and it's going to be our job in here to add a new item on to the expenses array. How do we get access to that array? Well, if you remember from the previous sections, we use this to access that object. So this would give us the object, dot expenses would give us that array. How do we add a new item on to an array? Well, we could have used onShift to add things to the beginning, or we might have used push to add things on to the end. I'm going to go ahead and use push, though the other way would be perfectly fine. Now, what are we going to do with push? Well, with push, we pass in the item to add on to the array. We have an array of what? We have an array of objects, so we need to create an object right here. You might have defined this object as a variable up above and then passed it in. That would be fine as well. Now, what needs to go on this object? Well, I mentioned that each expense needs a description property and an amount property. So I'm going to create a description property and set it equal to description. And down below, I'm going to create an amount property and set it equal to the amount argument value. Now, that's all we need to do for add expense. At this point, it should be working correctly, manipulating our expenses array. The other method I wanted you to add was get account summary. Right here, we can add that after add expense, comma, enter, get account summary. We set this up as a function. This function actually doesn't take any arguments. Its job is to just calculate up all of the expenses and then print a little summary. So to get this done, I suggested that you use for each, but I didn't really tell you anything more about that. Now, you might have gotten stuck and referred to the web to figure out how this works, and that's okay. Coming up with a solution based off of your research is a great way to solve a problem. What I wanted you to do was create a variable right here. And you could have called this something like total expenses or anything else, and we're going to start this off at 0. Now, what we're going to do is return our template string. Return a little template string. In here, we start off with the account holder's name. So $ curly braces to interpolate a value. That would be this dot name. Then has followed by the $. Now we want to actually inject the bounce. So right here, $ curly braces. That would be the total expenses variable from above. And then after that, we just have the static text in expenses, period. Now at this point in time, we could run the program. The only thing is that total expenses isn't going to contain the correct value. I'm going to do just that. Over in the terminal, node expense tracker.js. When I run the script, I get Andrew Mead has $0 in expenses. So some stuff is working, some stuff is not. How do we add up all of the expenses? Well, we want to do something for each expense. When we want to do something for everything in an array, we use for each. So right here, what you should have done is used this dot expenses dot for each. This is going to allow us to pass in a callback function. And we know that with this callback function, we get access to the individual item. Since this is an array of expenses, I can call this individual one an expense. Down below, what are we trying to do with the expense? We're trying to use its amount property to increment the value above. So total expenses is going to equal the old value for total expenses plus the amount property on expense. So expense dot amount. Now we're actually going to be adding up all of the expenses, and in the end of the day, total expenses is going to have the correct value as opposed to 0. If we save the file and rerun things from the terminal, I get Andrew Mead has $952 in expenses, which is indeed correct. So there we have it. We have our little expense tracker. It went from using a single number to track our expenses to an array of objects, allowing us to more accurately model data that we're probably going to want to store. And now it's time for our part 2 challenge. For part 2, we are going to take income into account. So right here, let me outline what I'd like you to do. First up is going to be add an income array to the account. So we can start this off as an empty array like we do for expenses. Then as step 2, you're going to set up an add income method. And this method is also going to take a description. So is the income from your job, a side project, whatever, and an amount. How much did you make? Now, this alone is going to be very similar to what we already have, but instead of expenses, it's going to be income. What I'd also like you to do as the third and final step is to tweak get account summary. So much like we had in the previous example, what I want you to do is figure out how much I have in expenses, how much I have in income, and then my account balance. So the income minus the expenses. And you're going to print a more complex summary, and that's going to look a little bit like this. Andrew Mead has a balance of, followed by my balance. Let's go ahead and say it's $10. And then I would talk about my money in income and my money in expenses. So right here, I could say 100 in income, and then I would say 90 in expenses. So in this situation, I have 100 in income, 90 in expenses. That brings me to an account balance of 10. It's going to be your job to not only calculate the total expenses like we already have, but also the total income and the balance. Then when you're done, all you really need to do to switch things up is to add a little bit of income into the mix. So right here, I could say account dot add income, and let's say I just add it from my job, and let's say I make 1,000. So what does that leave me with? That should leave me with $48 as my final account balance. Take some time to knock this one out and then test your work. Once again, if you get stuck, refer to anything out there, pause the video, come back, and when you're done, click play. All right, how'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to get that done. Let's dive right in by first creating that income array. So this is going to be a piece of data alongside of name and expenses. I'll call it income, and I'm going to start it off with nothing. Though if we were loading data in from some sort of saved location, like we'll do later, we might have some data already populated when the application starts, but not now. Down below, after add expense, we're going to add the other method. That's step 2, add income. Add income is going to look super similar. It's just going to be working with the income array instead of the expenses array. The arguments list is identical. We have our description and we have our amount. Down below, we add a trailing comma separating our properties. Now, what do we do inside of here? We access this .income.push to add that on. We push on a new object. Income, just like expenses, is an array of objects. We set description equal to the value passed in from the description argument. Then we add a comma, hit enter, and we add on amount, setting the amount property equal to whatever was passed in as the amount argument. The next thing we needed to do was step 3, which is to tweak get account summary. We want to take the income into account as well. I want to add up not just the total expenses, but also the total income, and then I want to include all of that information in my template string. So right here, I'm going to create a few other variables. First up, let total income equal 0, and then let account balance equal 0. So all of these start off at 0. We are going to change total income using a for each loop, just like we did for expenses. So right here, before or after the other one, it doesn't really matter. This dot income dot for each, passing in our callback function. We do need to access the item. So right here, I will define that argument, income, and then down below, all we're going to do is manipulate total income. Total income equals the old value for total income plus the new value. The new value comes from income dot amount. Now we're going to be successfully summing up all of the pieces of income. And before we actually go through the process of changing this template string, we want to update the account balance. So right here, the account balance is now equal to, it's going to equal the total income minus the total expenses. This is going to give us our account balance. Now we have all of the data necessary to fill out the string down below. So we are still going to start off with the name. This name, and then right here, has a balance of, we add the $, and then $, curly braces to inject the account balance, which I stored in the account balance variable. After that, we add a period, and we move on to the income. So I'm going to add a $, and then inject the income, that is total income, followed by the words in income, period, then a $, for expenses. We inject it with $, curly braces, total expenses, which we already had defined, and then right here, the words in expenses, period. So this is going to give us everything we were hoping for. We're adding up both, we're getting our account balance, and we're dumping it all in the account summary return value. Let's go ahead and actually test our work by removing the comments down below, saving the file, and over inside of the terminal, I am going to rerun that script. I rerun the script, and what do I get? I get an error. Right here, total income is not defined. Now, this is a real error. This isn't me trying to create an error just to prove a point. I actually made a mistake. Now, at this point, in real time, I have two choices. I can choose to scratch this. I can stop recording the video, and I can go back and do it right, or I can continue on. And I'm going to make the choice to continue on because I made a real mistake. So let's go ahead and solve it. Right here, total income is not defined. Right away, I see that I didn't name total income with a lowercase I, which means I must have mistyped it somewhere. And if I do dig into the code, I can see total income, and then right here looks good. Here it is. So this is where the error lives. All I do is replace the lowercase I with the uppercase I, cross my fingers, and rerun the script again. Creating errors and fixing them is part of normal life. Clear. Up arrow key twice, we rerun expense tracker, and this is what we get. Andrew Mead has a balance of $48, $1,000 in income, $952 in expenses. And with this in place, we are all done with this video. In this one, you are required to use a lot of the stuff we learned so far in the course. And this is great because the more code you write in the course, the better shot you're going to have of being able to use JavaScript in a productive way once the course is over and I'm gone. The guidance is great, but it's also important to get comfortable writing things on your own, coming up with new ideas for how to solve problems. That's where we're going to stop for this video, and that is also the end of this section. In this section, we learned a bunch about arrays and how they're going to allow us to model real-world pieces of information, like a list of expenses or an array of notes. Now, this was also the hardest section in the course. So if you're feeling a little discouraged about the speed of this section, I promise that not only are we going to slow down a little bit in the next section, we're also going to finally tie our scripts to a real application. So we're going to start integrating some of this stuff into JavaScript in the browser, allowing us to do things like get our description and amount from the user via a form and display the account summary inside of the web page. I'm really excited to get to all of that and more. Let's go ahead and jump right in to the next section.